Hey guys, how are you? Today you will witness a day in my life where I practice with podcasts, with one of the podcasts where Chamberlain is the guest. Today I will show you guys how I practice with podcasts and how can you practice with podcasts, what are the disadvantages and advantages of practicing with podcasts. We're gonna talk about those things, okay? Now, the first thing that I do in order to practice with podcasts, obviously I choose my podcast and I've chosen this podcast for improve my English. The first thing I do is normally, while I'm having my breakfast, I watch the podcast, right? And I only work on like the 5 minutes of the podcast per day or 7 minutes of the podcast per day, okay? Listen to our podcast. That means I will not be working for on the 2 hours of the podcast today. So today I will be practicing with the only first 10 minutes of the podcast. For instance, when I get to minute 10 right here to this line, I will start practicing.
I will say that for one, not having a relationship to look up to when you're growing up does become a little bit jarring when you're older and you're like, okay, I'm in my first relationship. What is this supposed to look like?
I will say that not having a relationship to look up to does become a little bit jarring when you're older. Okay, this is the line that I will stop. Now the thing is, you can obviously get the script of this podcast. If you're watching this podcast on Spotify, you will see that there are subtitles here. There's transcript here, okay? I copy-pasted transcript and I got the script of this podcast. And when it comes to practicing with podcasts, first of all, I work on my documents. I work on my scripts. Before I get to practicing with podcasts, I first of all highlight some of the important lines. When it comes to practicing with podcasts or talk shows or YouTube videos, first of all, I underline the lines that I find really important. For instance, in one of my videos, you can see me saying that today we have a very busy day ahead of us. Today we have a very busy day ahead of us, okay? For instance, this line is not mine, okay? This is not my line. I picked up this line from Kennedy.
We have a busy day ahead of us.
When I was practicing with Kennedy, one of the videos of Kennedy, I saw that Kennedy was saying this, okay, we have a very busy day ahead of us, or something like that. And I was like, oh my God, this is a very great expression. I want to incorporate this expression, this sentence into my life. And I remember I specifically emphasized this line. I underlined this line. I was like, okay, Arsene, pay attention to this line because there's a chance that you might want to use this line in your life. For instance, we're gonna get into the evolution of you. For instance, I like this line. I wanted to highlight this line, underline this line. I highlight the lines that I find really important that I might want to use it in the future in my life. The other thing is, I always underline the questions. I find it really important to improve your asking question ability. My asking question ability in order to have a good conversation. If you're able to ask good questions, if you can ask good questions, then you can have a good conversation. For me personally, asking question in another language is always harder than answering the questions. So this is why I always underline the questions. That's the second thing I do. And lastly, every single time when I come across a word that I've never seen before, for instance, there were words that I had never seen before in my life in this podcast, obviously I highlight those words, I underline those words, and I take a note, I write down those words' meanings. Whether, it's in my first language, Turkish or English, it doesn't matter, I don't care. Today, basically, I will be working on the first 10 minutes of this episode. But first things first of all, I need to watch the podcast. First 10 minutes of this podcast while I'm having my breakfast. Okay, guys? Okay, guys, now the first 10 minutes of the podcast, I watched this first 10 minutes of the podcast. I finished my breakfast. Now I'm gonna get to practicing. Before I start practicing with this podcast, I just want to tell you a few things. First of all, podcasts are not for beginner level. Practicing with podcasts is not suitable for those of you who are beginner. What are the disadvantages and advantages of practicing with podcasts? First of all, I want to talk about this. Before you start practicing with podcasts, ask this question to yourself. What is your interest in life? What are your interests in life? What do you do for a living? What is your job? What do you do? What do you study? Let's say, let's say you're going to university. What do you study? What are your interests in life? And find podcasts, find topics that are related to your interests in life. I don't know, maybe that's media, that's fashion, that's a design, that's social media, that's business, marketing, art, cinema, whatever interest you have in life. Find those podcasts that cover your interests and get those podcasts, get the script of those podcasts and practice with those podcasts, because practicing with podcasts will help you to get more and more familiar with the terms that you're interested in, and will help you to get a deeper understanding on the topics that you want to talk about. Practicing with podcasts will help you to make longer and longer sentences on the topics that you want to talk about. So basically, podcasts will help you to master your English. Podcasts will not help you learn English, it will help you to master your English. This is the biggest advantage of practicing with podcasts. But what is the disadvantage of practicing with podcasts? First of all, practicing with podcasts might be so boring. I find it really boring to practice with podcasts. The reason is because, for instance, when I practice with friends, when I practice with TV shows, when I practice with YouTubers, Kennedy, Case Neistat, other YouTubers, I enjoy it. Awful play, man. Wow.
Awful play, man. What?
Like, because they are the characters that I love. Like, when I practice with friends or normal people, there is a story, there is an emotion.
Not this time, no. Why? Would you like an invitation next time?
No, not this time, no. Why? Would you like an invitation next time? When you feel emotions, there's a higher chance that you can improve, you can enjoy the process.
When you're older and you're like, okay, I'm in my first relationship, what is this supposed to look like?
I'm in my first relationship, and what is that supposed to look like? When you're older, you're like, okay, I'm in my first relationship, and what is that supposed to look like? I'm gonna make my coffee, but while I'm making my coffee, I just wanna talk about a few words that I learned from this podcast, okay? So that, by talking about these words, maybe I will reduce my chance to forget those words in the long term. In this podcast, Emma Chamberlain says butt heads.
We're more like sisters, I would say. Like, we used to butt heads a lot when I was growing up. And
so, we used to butt heads a lot when I was growing up, so butt heads. I never seen this word butt heads before. I had no idea what butt head meant. Emma Chamberlain used to butt head a lot with her mom. If you disagree with someone, if you argue with someone, if you fight with someone, not physically but verbally, that means you butt head with this person. The best example I can give you is, for instance, I have a sister who is 2 years younger than me, and my sister and my mom, they butt head a lot, and that means they argue a lot. My mom likes to keep the house clean, and my mom is kind of like a very organized and neat person. Like, she likes to keep the house as clean as possible. Like, she's very organized, she's very obsessed with cleaning. And my sister is kind of like the opposite of that. My sister is kind of very casual, not super organized, I would say, but not dirty or not fully messy. My mom is always getting angry with my sister. She butt heads a lot with my sister, saying okay, you're so messy, you're not organized, etc. And my mom gets always angry. And my sister is kind of okay, you're kind of neat freak, okay, you're obsessed with cleaning, you're just a neat freak, don't interfere in my life, okay? And they kind of butt head a lot, and I'm okay, calm down. I always try to find the middle way between them. They're both right in their own way. Basically, my mom and sister, they butt head a lot. So basically, if you butt head with someone, so in this situation, if you butt head with someone, that means you fight with someone, not physically but verbally. You disagree with someone and you kind of argue with this person. The other word that I learned from this podcast is jarring.
But I will say that, for one, not having a relationship to look up to when you're growing up does become a little bit jarring when you're older.
I will say that, for one, not having a relationship to look up to when you're growing up does become a little bit jarring. Jarring. I had no idea what jarring meant. I learned this word jarring from Emma Chamberlain again. Jarring means that if something is unpleasant and disturbing and makes you uncomfortable, if something is harshly disturbing, that means it's jarring. The best example I can give you is, for instance, every morning before you go to work, you wake up to your alarm sound, right? You wake up to your alarm, and it's a very jarring sound. And you can say that, oh, this is so jarring. That means it's so unpleasant. It makes me so irritated. It's so disturbing. The sound of your alarm every morning that you wake up to is so jarring. That means it's so disturbing, it's so annoying, it's so irritating, it's so unpleasant. For instance, I love making YouTube videos so much, but the jarring part of making YouTube videos is editing. The most boring, unpleasant part of making YouTube videos is editing, because editing takes so much time and so much effort. And I can say that I find it really jarring to edit videos. Like, editing videos is really jarring, okay? That means editing videos is not pleasant, okay?
But a lot of people there are very wealthy. There's like a very big gap, I would say, between, it's like very, very, very wealthy and then like very like lower middle class.
There's like a very big gap, you know, I would say, between like, it's like very, very wealthy. It's like very, very wealthy and then like very lower middle class, and it's like very, very wealthy and then like very lower middle class.
It felt like there was a very stark difference.
It felt like there's a very stark difference. I had no idea what stark difference meant up until today. So basically I learned the meaning of stark difference from Emma Chamberlain. Stark, that means it's very obvious, it's very clear. If there is a stark difference, that means there is a strong, clear difference, obvious difference. For instance, guys, there is a stark difference between American accent and British accent. That means there is a clear and obvious difference between American accent and British accent. So it's impossible to confuse those accents to each other. Today, instead of doing my shadowing at night, I'm gonna do shadowing right now and then after doing my shadowing, I'm gonna go outside, take a little walk.
So it was like, oh my god, getting so stressed out.
Which I was like, oh my god. So I was like, oh my god, getting so stressed out. So I was like, oh my god, getting so stressed out.
So then I'm like watching the clock profusely, literally by the minute.
So I'm like then watching the clock profusely, and then I'm like watching the clock profusely, literally by the minute, because
I have horrible anxiety about being late.
I have horrible anxiety about being late. Okay, profusely. I don't know what this word means. So I looked it up and I saw that when someone says profusely, like I check the clock profusely.
Watching the clock profusely, literally by the minute.
Like every single minute. That means you check the clock a lot. Basically, if you do something profusely, that means you do something a lot. Every single minute she checks the clock. She checks the clock every single minute. That means she does this a lot. So basically profusely. Right now I learned the meaning of profuse. And I want to say something. This is what living the language is like. And this is one of the main reasons why I still keep doing shadowing. I mean, obviously, I want to speak with a better pronunciation. I want to improve my pronunciation as much as I possibly can, obviously. But at the same time, watching people whose English is first language is very important for me, because it's also motivating me to immerse myself in the culture. I just want to say something here. It feels so weird to watch a girl who does her makeup while talking, because I have no interest in makeup at all. But I do use those videos as a content for learning English. You know what I mean? So, like, you know, in this case, in my experience, Avrey is a English teacher. You know what I mean? Because I have no interest in makeup whatsoever. You know, like, I couldn't care less. But for me, for my English learning purpose, practicing with Avrey, who does a makeup while speaking, is a great content for me. You know what I mean? So yeah. I have horrible anxiety about being late. Alright, right now I'm listening to Daisy, Paul interview normal people, because that I also at the same time I've been practicing with normal people, so
screen than in my actual life.
How red have I got?
it's very windy and so it's blowing so cold, so I'm not gonna take a long walk because I'm cold. So, okay, I'm very close with her. We're like sisters. I'm very close with her. How would you describe? How do you describe your parents? How do you describe your parents? How do you describe your parents? So your parents are in some of your content. How do you describe your parents? You guys are obsessed with my hair. Anyways, so your parents are in some of your content. They seem very chill. How do you describe your parents? I will start with my dad. My dad is very open-minded and creative, so